Ethan Price thought he was filming a quiet Sunday stroll, and Mia Collins seemed like just another neighbor in the background, until the footage revealed a murder scene they both already knew too much about. The day was bright, with sunlight spilling across the sidewalks of Willow Creek and a breeze rattling the leaves of the old maple trees that lined the streets. It was the kind of afternoon that made the small town seem untouched by trouble. Ethan Price strolled casually, his camera in hand, the faint hum of cicadas filling the gaps between the muffled sounds of traffic a few blocks away. He had no plan, no storyboard in mind, just the habit of recording whatever caught his eye. His friends joked that he never saw the world without looking through a lens. To him, moments were only real if they were captured. The footage began with shaky shots of ordinary life: children riding bikes down the road, a dog barking behind a white picket fence, the glint of sunlight bouncing off the chrome of a parked car. Ethan shifted angles often, zooming in, panning out, crouching to capture a pair of ants crawling along the curb. His voice never appeared in the audio. The only sounds were the wind, the occasional passing car, and the distant muffled laughter of unseen neighbors. It was only when he reached the corner of Rosewood Lane that the nature of his recording changed. The street was quieter here, the kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. The camera tilted as Ethan slowed his steps, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. At the far end of the street stood a pale blue house, with chipped paint and a sagging front porch. The place looked tired, like it had been left behind while the rest of the neighborhood kept moving. Ethan's camera focused on it without hesitation. The zoom tightened, bringing the front door into view. It was open just enough to show a sliver of shadow beyond the frame. The door moved gently as though nudged by a breeze, though the surrounding trees stood perfectly still. In the narrow gap between the door and the frame, light didn't pour through. Instead, there was a murky darkness, like the house itself was swallowing the sunlight. His steps grew slower. The footage wavered with each heartbeat, and for a moment the lens drifted to the bottom of the doorframe. That was when it caught the dark stain, uneven, glossy in places where the sun struck it. The trail led from the threshold down the wooden steps where it had pooled in a jagged pattern before trickling along the front path toward the lawn. He moved closer. The change in audio was subtle but noticeable. The wind seemed to fade, replaced by the low hum of something unseen, like air pressing too heavily against the microphone. The Thager bobbed slightly as he adjusted his grip, one hand holding it steady while the other brushed against his jeans. The lens picked up the texture of the steps, the splintering wood, the shadow of the swaying door, and that same trail of darkness which seemed thicker the closer he got. At the edge of the porch, Ethan paused. The focus blurred for a moment, then sharpened again as the camera turned toward the street behind him. In the distance, someone stood still on the sidewalk, backing. The figure was motionless, their face partially obscured by the sunlight. It was only a few seconds, but the stillness of the scene was unsettling, almost staged. Without lingering, Ethan turned the camera back to the open door. There was no sound of footsteps, no sign of anyone inside, yet the door continued its slow, rhythmic sway. The footage tightened once more on the sliver of darkness inside. His breathing became audible now, low and uneven. Each step he took forward seemed careful, measured, almost reluctant. The porch creaked faintly under his weight, and the microphone caught the sharp sound of something shifting deep inside the house. A faint thud, distant but deliberate. Ethan didn't call out. He didn't step inside. The footage lingered at the doorway, framing the darkness like it was a portrait. His breathing quickened, but his stance never changed. After several seconds, the camera lowered slightly, capturing the threshold itself. The wood there was worn, scuffed, marked by scratches that ran deep into the grain. Something about them didn't look random. The video ended without explanation. No retreat, no sudden action, just the same steady framing of the open door and the silent house beyond it. Later, this clip would be frozen, analyzed, and discussed in detail by people who would never meet Ethan, but would know this scene as the moment the quiet charm of Willow Creek began to fracture. Rosewood Lane had always been a place where nothing seemed urgent enough to speak about. The houses sat in neat rows, their driveways lined with trimmed hedges and flower beds that bloomed without fail, each egging. The people who lived there knew each other by name, but rarely by anything deeper. It was a neighborhood of polite nods, short waves, and conversations that never strayed beyond the weather. That quiet surface made it easy for small things to go unnoticed or to be ignored entirely. 2 weeks before the day Ethan stood on the porch of the blue house, there had been noises. They started as faint, irregular thuds late in the evening, sometimes followed by something that sounded like furniture scraping a floor. On one particularly still night, a neighbor swore they heard a muffled crash from inside the house, the sound echoing briefly through the narrow street before fading into silence. No one investigated. People reasoned it was none of their business, or that it was just the creak and groan of an old home settling into its foundations. There were other signs, too. A delivery driver who brought a package to the blue house one night noticed the living room light flickering wildly, casting sharp shadows against the drawn curtains. The driver described the way the light seemed to pulse, as though someone inside was moving back and forth across the bulb. When the door went unanswered, he left the package on the porch and didn't look back. By morning, the box was gone, though no one had seen anyone take it inside. The blue house itself had an air of neglect, standing out from the others on the street. Its paint was faded and peeling, the front steps sagging under the weight of years without repair. But it wasn't abandoned. The mailbox always had new envelopes tucked inside, and sometimes a faint trail of smoke would drift from the chimney on cold mornings. It was a house that looked empty but never was. Mia Collins knew that feeling better than most. Living just 2 houses down, she passed the place almost every day. She had once told Ethan she didn't like walking near it at night, though she never explained why. There was a tension in the way she glanced toward it, a flicker of weariness that didn't match her usual calm demeanor. On the day Ethan filmed the open door, that tension became visible on camera. When investigators later reviewed the footage, they noticed her in the background, a still figure standing on the sidewalk, partially in shadow. She wasn't moving, not even shifting her weight from one foot to the other, and her gaze was fixed directly on Ethan. She didn't seem startled by the open door or the dark stain on the steps. She didn't seem confused. She only watched. That frozen image of her would be played back over and over, slowed down until every detail could be examined. Her hands were at her sides, her shoulders slightly hunched forward, her mouth set in a firm line. There was no fear in her posture, only something that might have been recognition. The people who lived on Rosewood Lane would later claim they had seen nothing unusual that day. Some admitted they hadn't been outside at all. Others said they remembered seeing Ethan walking with his camera but didn't think much of it. He was always recording something. No one could say for sure if they'd noticed Mia standing there or if they had, whether they'd thought it strange. That was the way this neighborhood worked. Details slipped between the cracks. A figure standing in the sunlight staring at a house with its door hanging open didn't draw suspicion. The street had trained itself to look away from things that didn't fit, to pretend that what was odd was actually ordinary. In the days after, as police pieced together timelines and accounts, Rosewood Lane's quiet reputation began to crumble. It turned out there had been whispers about the noises, the lights, the packages that disappeared, about the lone figure sometimes seen at the upstairs window. None of it had been enough for anyone to act, and yet, all those ignored fragments would later form the outline of something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. When the first police car turned onto Rosewood Lane, the flashing lights broke the stillness in a way nothing else had that day. The low hum of the engine grew louder as it slowed in front of the pale blue house, its tires crunching softly over the gravel that had spilled from the driveway. Ethan was still on the porch, camera in hand, standing just far enough back from the open doorway to avoid stepping inside. The dark trail across the steps had dried into an uneven pattern, and the breeze that moved the door now felt colder, sharper. The officers stepped out with the kind of brisk movement that suggested they had been briefed on only the basics. They approached without hesitation, their eyes scanning the porch, the threshold, and the shape of Ethan holding his camera steady. One of them glanced at the stain before crossing it, boots making a dull, sticky sound against the wood. The other officer moved to the side, peering in through the crack of the door before pushing it open wider. The sound of the hinges groaning filled the quiet. The camera followed as they stepped over the threshold, revealing a dim hallway lined with peeling wallpaper. Dust floated in the beam of light from the open door, drifting down in lazy spirals. The hallway led straight to a living room where the disorder was immediate. An overturned chair, a coffee table on its side, and fragments of a shattered mug scattered across the floor. The pooled liquid beneath it had dried into a pale crust, sticky enough to cling to the soles of their boots. Near the couch, a pair of women's shoes sat neatly, side by side, their placement so precise it looked deliberate. The cushions on the couch were dented and creased, as though someone had been sitting there not long ago. One officer moved through the room slowly, touching nothing, eyes sweeping over every detail. The other headed toward the kitchen, their flashlight beam catching on something metallic before disappearing into the shadows. The camera angle shifted as Ethan stepped just inside the doorway, staying behind the officers but close enough to keep the scene in frame. In the kitchen, a large pot sat on the stove, its lid tilted just enough to reveal steam still clinging to the underside. The faint smell of something cooked meat perhaps lingered in the air, but it was tainted by another odor, heavier and more acrid. Drawers were half open, one of them hanging crookedly on its runners, and the faint scrape of the officer's boots against the linoleum echoed into the next room. The creak of the stairs drew all attention upward. The first officer had begun climbing, flashlight cutting sharp arcs across the narrow stairwell. The air grew thicker as they reached the top, and the smell that had been faint downstairs now pressed in heavily, filling every breath. The hallway at the top of the stairs was lined with closed doors, but one stood ajar. The moment the beam of light fell inside, the camera caught the still shape on the bed. It was Angela Carter, her body lying awkwardly across the mattress, her clothes torn and stained, the bedding beneath her soaked through. The room bore the marks of a struggle. Drawers emptied onto the floor, a lamp shattered, the curtain rod torn halfway from the wall. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint distant creak of the house settling under their weight. Ethan's footage captured the exact second the officer stepped back from the doorway and met the eyes of his partner downstairs. The signal was clear. This was no longer just a welfare check. The camera lingered on the room, zooming slightly, holding on the stillness as though waiting for something to move, but nothing did. The call for the coroner went out within minutes. Ethan stayed where he was, recording as more officers arrived, their radios crackling with clipped urgent updates. Outside, neighbors began to gather in small knots, their faces pale, their whispers drifting on the wind. Rosewood Lane, so practiced in ignoring what it didn't want to see, could no longer pretend. When detectives took Ethan's camera into evidence, they treated it like any other piece of potential material, bagged, labeled, and logged. It wasn't until the footage was reviewed in a quiet back room at the precinct that the first real crack in his story began to form. The initial clip was already unsettling. The slow approach to the blue house, the open door swaying in silence, the dark trail staining the porch steps. But the memory card held more than that single scene. Several other files were tucked between unrelated shots of sidewalks, parked cars, and street corners. One stood out immediately. The timestamp placed it almost 24 hours before the day the police arrived, long before anyone learned to have seen Ethan near the blue house. The video began in near darkness, illuminated only by the dim, yellow light spilling from a hallway lamp. The camera was moving slowly, following that same dark trail across the floor. The stain was fresher here, wet enough to glisten when the lens caught it at the right angle. The footage moved past the living room, past the overturned furniture, and into the narrow staircase. There was no sound beyond the faint rustle of clothing and the low mechanical whir of the camera adjusting its focus. Upstairs, the bedroom door stood wide open, and the camera paused in the doorway. The bed was already soaked through, the still form of Angela Carter lying in the center, her hair spread unevenly across the pillow. The image stayed there for several seconds, before tilting slightly to catch the reflection in a mirror across the room. It was Ethan, his own reflection, faint but unmistakable, holding the camera at chest height and glancing at something beyond the frame. His expression was hard to read. Not shock, not grief, but something quieter, more measured, as though the scene in front of him was less a discovery and more a recording session he had planned. Another file showed the same house, but this time in daylight. The angles almost identical to the footage from the official police arrival. The difference was in the silence. No sirens in the distance. No officers' voices, only the hum of the camera and Ethan's slow breathing. He stepped through the house again, retracing the same path, pausing in the same places as though rehearsing a sequence. When confronted with these clips during questioning, Ethan claimed he had stumbled onto the scene the night before and panicked. He said he left too afraid to call the police immediately, and returned the next day to film what he'd seen in case no one believed him. It was an explanation that might have been believable if not for the fact that the timestamps on the videos didn't match his movements according to phone location records. He had been in the area for hours that night, not minutes. Detectives also noticed what the camera didn't capture. No sign of an initial reaction. No evidence that he had tripped over anything, opened a door or discovered the scene by accident. The movements were too smooth, too intentional. Each frame felt deliberate, like the work of someone who wanted a particular version of the truth to exist on film. An evidence technician flagged something else buried in the footage. In the corner of the mirror's reflection, behind Ethan, there was a faint blur of movement, a shadow slipping out of the doorway and down the hall. It was impossible to make out details, but the size and shape suggested another person had been upstairs with him. That possibility shifted the investigation's focus. If Ethan wasn't alone, then who had been there, and why had that person vanished from every ever record of the night? The detectives kept watching, replaying each clip frame by frame. What had once looked like the work of an amateur filmmaker wandering into a crime scene now seemed more like a carefully constructed sequence, the purpose of which was still unknown. Every image carried the same unsettling sense that the person behind the camera wasn't shocked by what he was seeing. He was documenting it. Phone records filled in the gaps that Ethan's footage had left open. Over the weeks before Angela Carter's death, there had been dozens of exchanges between her and Ethan, messages that ranged from terse and confrontational, cryptic and urgent. Angela's tone in many of them suggested leverage, as though she possessed something Ethan didn't want exposed. Detectives uncovered enough to piece together the edges of it: references to a deal, mentions of what happened in Fairbrook, and repeated warnings that she would make it public if he didn't cooperate. Fairbrook was a town 40 miles away, a place marked in old police files by a string of accidental fires that had never been solved. The investigation began to stretch in two directions, one into Angela's past and her connection to Ethan, and the other into the possibility that someone else had been at the house before or during the time of her death. That shadow in the mirror from the earlier footage became more significant when a neighbor's doorbell camera revealed something new. The grainy clip showed Mia Collins, Ethan's girlfriend, walking toward the blue house late at night. She carried a large duffel bag slung low against her side. The footage caught her slipping inside without knocking and re-emerging an hour later with the bag collapsed flat against her body, looking lighter. When questioned, Mia claimed she had been dropping off clothes to Angela, who she described as a friend. But Angela's phone contained no messages from Mia in the days or weeks leading up to that night, and none of Angela's surviving belongings matched the description of what Mia claimed she had delivered. The story began to unravel when forensics examined the bag, which was recovered from Mia's apartment during a search warrant. Traces of blood were found inside, along with fibers that matched Angela's bedding. Investigators now believed the sequence of events began with an argument between Mia and Angela. The motive wasn't immediately clear, but the working theory was that Angela had learned something incriminating about Ethan and confronted him through Mia. The confrontation escalated in the bedroom of the Blue House, ending violently. Mia, faced with the aftermath, had called Ethan not for help in contacting the police but for help in removing evidence. Instead of reporting the crime, Ethan arrived with his camera. Whether his intent was to document for himself, for some future leverage, or for the notoriety of a discovery, no one could conclude. But the precision of his filming, the fact that he recorded twice before police were involved, and the absence of any attempt to assist Angela, told its own story. In those hours between the first set of footage and the second, nothing had been done to alert anyone. The house had simply remained as it was, silent except for the shifting of its old beams. As the case moved toward charges, prosecutors focused on the disturbing duality in Ethan's role. He wasn't just a bystander who failed to act, but someone who had chosen to center himself in the scene, turning a crime into material. His silence, his deliberate return, and his decision to frame the discovery as if it were unfolding in real time, made him part of the event, not merely a witness. Mia faced the far graver charge, but both would be bound together in the public's mind. When the footage was eventually released in edited form for trial, it sparked a wave of online discussion. Viewers dissected every movement of the camera, every pause, every detail in the background. Some claimed Ethan's breathing changed in certain moments, as though he were suppressing words. Others focused on the brief, almost imperceptible shift in Mia's expression when she appeared in the distance, watching him from the sidewalk. The last scene, the one that had first drawn attention, the open door swaying under the sunlight, remained the most haunting. Without knowing what came after, it could have been just another strange moment in an otherwise uneventful day, but with the full story revealed, it became a frame frozen in implication, a threshold neither crossed nor closed, holding the weight of everything that had already happened inside. For the residents of Rosewood Lane, it was the moment their quiet street became something else entirely, a place marked forever by what was recorded and by who chose to record it.